Picture a closed-door House Ethics Committee session where the air feels thicker than the carpet and every chair squeaks like it's confessing something. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sits at the witness table with Riley Roberts' name hovering over the room like a second microphone nobody asked for. Across from her, Dan Bongino speaks in that flat, practiced tone that doesn't need drama because it's already holding the room hostage. No cheering, no cameras, no speechifying for clips, just paper, numbers, and the kind of silence that makes people suddenly fascinated by their own pens. And the first thing he puts on the table isn't ideology, it's a question about a house. He asks about a property in Wesley Heights, the kind of neighborhood people whisper about the way they whisper about private schools and legacy admissions. He says the price out loud, $4.2 million, and lets it sit there like a weight plate on the chest of the entire hearing. Then he says, paid in cash, and the phrase hits different. Because cash isn't just money, it's finality. No mortgage, no lender, no paper trail of payments over time, just a clean, close, and a clean deed, the way rich people like to do it when they can. So he asks the question every normal person would ask if they were being honest. How does a member of Congress do that on a member of Congress income? He doesn't call her names, he doesn't say crook, he doesn't say guilty, because the point isn't a label, it's the math. A congressional salary is public. Her years in office are public. And basic arithmetic is the one thing in Washington that doesn't take meetings. Even if you play the fantasy version where someone saves every cent and eats air for dinner, the numbers still don't stretch to a mansion in an elite D.C. enclave. That's not moral judgment, that's a calculator. And calculators, unlike political consultants, don't care who's trending. Ocasio-Cortez tries to pivot to message because message is what modern politics sells better than policy. She leans into the familiar language about harassment and targeting and the way powerful people always come for loud critics. It's not that those dynamics never happen in America, because anyone paying attention knows they do. But the room doesn't feel like it's there to debate sociology. It feels like it's there to stare at a ledger until somebody blinks. Bongino lets her talk, the way a cop lets a driver explain why the trunk smells like gasoline. Then he slides paper to the members, one set after another, like he's dealing cards nobody wants to see. He points to 3 wire transfers, all clustered in time, all sized like they came from boardrooms, not bake sales. He reads the dates and amounts as if he's reading weather, calm and unavoidable. He names the senders as LLCs, Progressive Future Fund, Grassroots Action Network, Democratic Advancement Coalition, generic names that sound like they were designed by a committee that loves the word movement. And he asks, without theatrics, why 3 Delaware entities would send 7 figures to a personal LLC right before a house purchase. This is where the room starts doing that quiet shifting thing. The sound of people trying not to look nervous while also trying to look interested. Because Delaware isn't a state in this context, it's a strategy. It's the place you go when you want an entity that exists on paper more than it exists in daylight. Nobody says shell company as a final conclusion, but the implication is baked into the choice of jurisdiction. The question becomes less, is it legal, and more, why does it look like that? Bongino doesn't say he can read minds, he says he can trace money, and those are very different claims. He gestures to a flow chart on a screen, the kind of chart that makes people feel small, because it suggests your life can be reduced to arrows. At the top are big donor world nouns, Open Society Foundations, Democracy Alliance, names that already live in America's political imagination, like boogeymen or benefactors, depending on who's talking. He's careful, at least in this reconstruction, to describe it as links, aligned networks, coordination, not as a signed confession. Still, when you draw enough arrows, the audience doesn't need you to shout the ending. A committee member, Virginia Fox, asks the obvious, who is behind the LLCs? Bongino answers like he's laying bricks, not building a bonfire, saying the investigation traced funding pathways back through donor coordination structures. He mentions George Soros because someone always mentions George Soros in these stories, and because the name carries instant electricity in American political culture. But he keeps it framed as source of funds questions, not as a cosmic conspiracy with a single villain twirling a mustache. That distinction matters, because one is analysis of financial routing and the other is fan fiction with a badge. Then the hearing hits a weird nerve that Washington pretends doesn't exist: the gap between a brand and a balance sheet. Ocasio-Cortez has always been a master of the brand, the insurgent voice, the working-class iconography, the I'm not like them posture that makes cable panels sweat. That brand is why her critics watch her like hawks and why her supporters defend her like family. A brand like that is powerful, and power creates incentives, and incentives create temptations that don't show up in slogans. So when someone says mansion in the same breath as bartender from the Bronx, the contradiction does half the prosecuting by itself. Bongino pivots to Riley Roberts because politics loves nothing more than a subplot that feels personal. He doesn't say nepotism as a verdict. He lays out a pattern of payments to a company tied to the partner of a sitting member of Congress. He reads off totals that sound too large to ignore and too boring to go viral unless you attach a scandal to them. He describes a consulting outfit that allegedly leaves a light digital footprint for something called digital outreach strategies, which is the kind of irony even DC can appreciate. And he asks what the deliverables were, the way any annoyed CFO would ask before approving a six-figure invoice. A fictional agent in this reconstruction, Jennifer Martinez, speaks in the clipped language of depositions and interviews. She says PAC officials described strategic advice, but couldn't point to files, reports, or a clear paper trail of work product. That doesn't automatically prove wrongdoing, because plenty of consulting is glorified conversation, and America runs on glorified conversation. But it raises the kind of question that doesn't go away. If the work is valuable, why is it so hard to describe? And if it's hard to describe, why is it so easy to pay? This is the part where the hearing becomes less about one person and more about the entire industry that feeds on political money. Washington is full of consultants whose main product is being in the right group chat. There are people who get paid for strategy, the way some people get paid for vibes, and the line between influence and output can get fuzzy fast. So the question isn't just, did Riley Roberts do work? It's, what counts as work in a system that rewards proximity? If a PAC pays a partner's firm and nobody can articulate results, is that corruption, incompetence, or just the modern economy wearing a suit? Then comes the Met Gala angle, because nothing says American contradiction like a populist message delivered in couture. Bongino references the tax the rich moment as an ethics question, not a fashion critique. And that's an important distinction even if the internet won't care. He cites ticket prices, dress valuations, styling costs, and the ethics threshold that members are trained on, the boring rules that exist to keep power from turning into a gift basket. The defense argues work-related optics because politics is now an industry where showing up is half the job. But the counter-question hangs there anyway. If you're condemning elite excess, why are you at the party where elite excess buys the table? Nobody in this reconstruction has to declare that a rule was definitely violated to make the room uneasy. It's enough to show the numbers and ask whether reimbursement happened, whether disclosure happened, whether exemptions apply. Even sympathetic members can look troubled, because ethics fights are rarely about one clean smoking gun, and more about a series of decisions that look bad in sequence. And sequence is deadly, because sequence turns one-off into pattern, and pattern is what voters remember when they stop trusting you. The whole thing starts to feel like a documentary where the narrator doesn't have to raise his voice. Bongino then stacks evidence next to rhetoric, and that's where political figures hate to live. He pulls up quotes about billionaires and dark money and integrity, not to mock them, but to force a comparison. It's a simple trick that works because it uses the subject's own words as the measuring tape. You can argue policy all day, but when your own tweet is on one side and a financial record is on the other, the debate gets smaller and sharper. The hearing doesn't need to prove motive to create damage. It just has to create doubt that feels plausible. The Democrats in the room, Jamie Raskin, Susan Wild in this version, try to find an off-ramp. They ask whether there was some philanthropic plan, some advocacy project, some future entity that could explain money moving into an LLC before being deployed. It's the kind of charitable framing lawmakers reach for when they want facts to land softly. But the narrative, as presented, keeps snapping back to that deed, that closing date, that cash payment that doesn't care about intentions. An LLC that owns only a residence looks less like movement building and more like asset holding, and people understand that in their bones. At this point, Ocasio-Cortez does what skilled politicians do when they're cornered by paperwork. She tries to widen the battlefield. She talks about persecution, about attacks on outspoken progressives, about the way institutions can be weaponized. Those are real themes in American history, and that's why the tactic is effective. But the committee chair, Michael Guest in this story, keeps pulling the conversation back to the same narrow lane. Explain the money. Explain the purchase. Explain the routing. Because a worldview argument can't dissolve a wire transfer. Her lawyer, Mark Elias, signals Fifth Amendment territory in the most lawyerly way possible. Not dramatic, just procedural. That alone changes the temperature in the room because invoking rights is legally ordinary but politically radioactive. People hear declines to answer, and their brains fill in whatever they already believe. Supporters hear overreach, critics hear caught, and the truth, if it exists in clean form, gets buried under the noise. That's the cruel genius of politics. Even neutral legal steps become narrative gasoline. Bongino starts asking yes or no questions in this reconstruction. Not because yes or no is fair, but because it's brutal. Did you receive funds from entities linked to George Soros? Becomes a trap whether she answers or not. If she says yes, it becomes a headline. And if she says no, it becomes a fight about what linked means and who defined it. If she refuses, the refusal itself becomes the story, because America loves process almost as much as America loves punishment. You can almost hear the future pundit panels forming in the ductwork. The hearing, as imagined here, doesn't end with handcuffs, because real life rarely gives you that clean of an ending. It ends with referrals, votes, stern statements, and the kind of institutional language that sounds sterile until you realize it can ruin careers. Referrals aren't convictions, and investigations aren't verdicts, but they're enough to turn a public figure into a permanent question mark. And in politics, being a question mark is sometimes worse than being wrong, because wrong can be argued and a question mark just hangs there. The room adjourns, and everybody walks out acting calm, like they didn't just watch a brand get put on trial by arithmetic. Then the outside world does what it always does. It takes complexity and turns it into a meme. People who already disliked Ocasio-Cortez treat the Manchin story like proof they've been right all along about champagne socialism. People who love her treat the hearing like a hit job dressed up as oversight, because they've seen real hit jobs in other contexts, and they know the playbook. The middle, the people who aren't ideologically married, mostly just ask one thing. What are the facts, and can anyone explain them cleanly? That middle is smaller than Twitter thinks, but it's often the group that decides who survives. If the story leaks, it leaks the way Washington always leaks, through unnamed sources with suspiciously good recall. A headline doesn't have to say crime to create the smell of it. It just has to say probe, scrutiny, questions, and let the public do the rest. Photos of a brick mansion next to photos of a tax-the-rich dress write their own punchline without anyone adding adjectives. And America loves a punchline, especially one that confirms something people wanted to believe about the other side. The irony becomes the story, and irony is the most viral currency in modern politics. The deeper problem is that the allegations, even framed cautiously, tap into a broader distrust that isn't partisan anymore. Voters assume everyone in power has a side hustle, a donor pipeline, a friend of a friend who cashes checks for consulting. They may not know campaign finance law, but they know vibes. And the vibe of mansion-paid cash is not the vibe of just like you. So even if explanations exist, they have to fight uphill against a public that has been trained to expect betrayal. That's why money stories are so dangerous. They don't need to be proven in court to be believed at the kitchen table. This reconstruction also plays on how Americans talk about dark money, like it's always someone else's problem. The right screams about it when it funds the left screams about it when it funds the right, and the donor class keeps writing checks either way. People treat it like a moral issue until they discover their team benefits from it. Then suddenly, it becomes a technicality. So when the hearing claims that progressive networks may be routing money through layers, it forces an uncomfortable mirror. Is the system corrupt or just selectively condemned? And if it's selectively condemned, what does that say about the sincerity of everyone involved? The mention of Democracy Alliance and Open Society Foundations is potent because those names already live in a world of suspicion and myth. Some people treat them like puppet masters, others treat them like philanthropic engines. And most people couldn't explain the structures if their rent depended on it. That's why the smartest version of this story doesn't declare certainty. It asks for transparency and lets viewers project their own anxieties onto the blank spaces. Who funded what? Why Delaware? Why now? Why these amounts? Why this timing? Are questions that feel reasonable even when answers are complicated. And reasonable questions, repeated often enough, can harden into assumptions. The Riley Roberts consulting thread is especially sticky because it hits a basic American instinct about fairness. Most people have had a job where they had to prove what they did, and most people know what it feels like when somebody else gets paid for being connected. So when a story suggests a partner's company received large sums from aligned PACs, the public doesn't need legal definitions to feel the imbalance. It doesn't matter whether the work was real in some abstract sense. People want to know why nobody can point to it. Show me is a working-class phrase, and it's devastating when applied to a consultant invoice. There's also the uncomfortable truth that modern politics blends celebrity, activism, and governance into one messy product. A member of Congress can be a legislator at noon, a cable guest at 5, and a brand at midnight, all while fundraising in between like it's a second job. That environment makes it easier for defenders to say, of course there are media deals and speaking fees and partnerships, because that's the era. But it also makes it easier for critics to say, exactly, this is a grift machine, because that's also the era. The question becomes whether the person is driving the machine or being driven by it, and Neither answer is flattering. When the story drifts toward book deals and bulk purchases, it touches another American nerve: laundering legitimacy through culture. A book isn't just a book. It's a credential, a brand extension, an invitation into the elite rooms you claim to dislike. Bulk purchases by friendly organizations can be read as support, or as manipulation, or as both, depending on your mood and your politics. Even without declaring wrongdoing, the optics of movement groups by thousands of copies invites the suspicion that the sales chart is a political scoreboard. And when politics turns everything into a scoreboard, nobody trusts the scorekeeper. The Met Gala thread adds a sharper edge because it's the kind of scene that makes ordinary Americans roll their eyes on instinct. A gala ticket price can be defended as fundraising, philanthropy, culture, whatever you want to call it. But the average voter hears that number and thinks of groceries, rent, car payments, and medical bills, and suddenly the entire event sounds like a different planet. So if a politician famous for criticizing wealth is pictured at the wealth party, people don't need further evidence to feel whiplash. That's not ideology, that's human psychology, and it's why political enemies love camera flashes. The committee dynamic, as imagined, is its own performance even without cameras. Republicans like James Comer can sound measured while still cutting like a razor, because they know restraint makes the blade look cleaner. Democrats can look torn, because defending a colleague too aggressively can make them look complicit. But abandoning her can split their own coalition. Everyone calculates how the story hits their base, their donors, their future primary challenger, their next fundraising email. And somewhere under the choreography is the boring question that doesn't care about anyone's future. What happened exactly, and can it be explained? If this escalates, it escalates the way scandals often do now, through documents, screenshots, sources familiar, and competing narratives that harden overnight. Supporters circulate counter-threads about right-wing obsession and institutional bias. Critics circulate flowcharts and mansion photos like they're trading cards. Neutral observers ask for primary documents and get yelled at by both sides for not choosing a team. And the person in the middle of it all becomes less of a human being and more of a battlefield. It's easy to joke about champagne socialism, but the deeper issue is how politics turns authenticity into a business model. Ocasio-Cortez didn't invent that, and she isn't the only one who benefits from it. But she's a particularly vivid symbol because her rise was built on a story Americans recognized and wanted to believe. When you sell hope as a brand, you can't be surprised when the public demands receipts like their customers returning a defective product. And in America, customers are ruthless when they feel conned. The cleverest version of this narrative never says, "She did it," because that's not necessary to keep viewers leaning forward. All it has to do is stack contradictions and let the audience ask, how could this be? Why would a personal LLC receive transfers from opaque entities right before a home purchase? Why would consulting fees flow without clear deliverables anyone can describe? Why would luxury event participation coexist with a message built around rejecting luxury culture? People underestimate how powerful questions are when you ask them with specificity. A vague accusation slides off, but a date and a dollar amount sticks like gum. June 8th, June 10th, June 12th, in a tight cluster, is memorable even if the viewer forgets every legal nuance. 1.2 million, 1.5 million, $1.5 million is memorable even if the viewer has never heard of a PAC. That's why investigators love timelines, and that's why politicians fear them. The other reason timelines scare people is that they strip away the comfort of context. Context is where everyone hides, because context is infinite. But a transfer on a Tuesday and a closing on a Friday is not infinite. It's finite, and it feels like intention, even when intention isn't proven. That's what makes this kind of story dangerous. It turns the audience into amateur prosecutors without ever asking them to be fair. And once the audience picks a verdict, facts become decoration. If Ocasio-Cortez wanted to survive a storm like this, she'd need something the internet rarely rewards: boring clarity. She'd need clean explanations, clean documents, clean disclosures, a narrative that doesn't require believers to trust the vibes. Because the minute a defense relies on vibes, the opposition will answer with screenshots. And screenshots are the modern equivalent of sworn testimony in the court of public opinion, even when they shouldn't be. Politics has trained the public to treat visuals as truth, and this story is rich in visuals. A mansion photo is a visual. A red carpet gown is a visual. A flowchart is a visual. And together, they form a collage that doesn't need narration. Even if every detail is contested, the collage creates an emotional conclusion before the legal conclusion ever arrives. That's why scandals are often decided early, before investigators finish, before committees vote, before anything official happens. The public doesn't wait for paperwork. The public waits for a feeling that makes sense. And the feeling of luxury funded by hidden money is one Americans are primed to accept because they've seen variations of it too many times. There's also a cynical symmetry in how both sides talk about corruption, depending on whose name is on the check. A Democrat linked to billionaires becomes proof the left is fake. A Republican linked to billionaires becomes proof the right is bought. And the billionaires keep winning either way. If this hearing story lands, it won't just land on Ocasio-Cortez, it will land on the whole performance of moral purity that modern politics sells. Because everyone claims to be fighting the system while using the system's loopholes like frequent flyer miles. And the public is exhausted enough to believe the worst, even when the worst hasn't been proven. The smartest political operators understand that the most damaging scandals are the ones that don't require explicit claims. They just require the audience to ask, "Are we being played?" That's why a quiet line like "declines to answer" can do more damage than an hour of shouting. It signals risk, and people assume risk means fire, even when sometimes it's just legal caution. But politics isn't a courtroom, and caution doesn't read as innocence. If the story keeps running, it eventually forces even allies to choose between the person and the principle. Figures like Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley would be pressured to comment, and every word would be interpreted as loyalty or betrayal. Even Bernie Sanders, the elder symbol of a movement, would get dragged into the framing whether he wanted it or not. And that's how one person's controversy becomes a referendum on an entire ideological brand. Movements can survive a policy loss, but they struggle to survive a hypocrisy story. The irony is that the hypocrisy label is often easier to weaponize than any clear legal theory. You don't need statutes, you need contrast. You need tax the rich next to Wesley Heights, and you let the audience do the rest. That's why politics has become a sport of optics more than a sport of governance, because optics can convict without trial. And in the era of infinite feeds, the first conviction is usually the only one that matters. In the end, the most honest way to tell a story like this is not to hand out verdicts, but to hold up the contradictions and refuse to look away. If a public figure's finances are clean, transparency is their armor, because numbers can defend as effectively as they can accuse. If the finances are complicated, complicated explanations need to be offered early, not after the public has already written the ending. And if the story is exaggerated, partisan, or built on selective documents, The only antidote is more documentation, not louder messaging. Because a narrative is easiest to beat when it's wrong on the facts, and hardest to beat when it's right on the vibe. So the question isn't whether you like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or hate her, because those feelings are cheap and plentiful. The real question is whether America can handle a politics where brand outruns accountability and where every side screams dark money until it benefits them. If a member of Congress can't clearly explain a cash mansion purchase without making it sound like a riddle, people will assume the riddle has a dirty answer. If aligned organizations can pour money into the orbit of public officials through layers of entities and nobody can explain the purpose in plain English, the public will assume the purpose is personal. And if the loudest anti-elite voices end up living like elites, people will stop believing anyone who promises to fight the elite. The problem is that once trust cracks, it doesn't come back through press releases or legal memos. It comes back only if people feel the story in their gut makes sense again. And right now, whether anyone likes it or not, the story most people feel is that American politics has turned into a marketplace where authenticity is a product and outrage is the marketing budget. Everyone claims to be different, everyone claims to be clean, and almost everyone eventually gets asked questions they wish had never been written down. It's not that corruption is new, it's that performance is now inseparable from power, and performance always creates blind spots. You can't spend years telling people you're not like the others, and then be shocked when they inspect you like you are the others. In older eras, scandals were about envelopes and briefcases and parking garages. Now they're about LLCs with inspiring names, consulting contracts nobody remembers signing, and Instagram posts that age badly in high resolution. The tools have changed, but the instinct hasn't. Follow the money, follow the relationships, follow the timing. People don't need to see a smoking gun anymore. They just need to see enough smoke to assume someone is hiding a lighter. And in a political culture already saturated with distrust, smoke spreads faster than facts. What makes this situation especially volatile is that Ocasio-Cortez isn't just another member of Congress. She represents an idea, not just a district. For millions of supporters, she symbolizes the possibility that politics could be younger, cleaner, less cynical, less captured by corporate interests. For millions of critics, she symbolizes everything they dislike about modern progressivism, moral certainty mixed with celebrity culture. When someone becomes a symbol, any crack feels like a crack in the whole building. That's why even neutral observers feel uneasy reading about mansion purchases and donor networks. Not because a politician owning property is inherently suspicious, but because the brand was built on the opposite image. It's the same reason nobody blinks when a hedge fund manager buys a penthouse, but everyone reacts when a working-class hero does. The issue isn't wealth itself, it's narrative coherence. And narrative coherence is the currency of modern politics. The hearing, real or imagined, functions less like a courtroom and more like a mirror. It reflects back what people already fear about the system, that it rewards those who can sell morality better than those who actually practice it. That fundraising language sounds noble until you see how it's operationalized. That movement building can start looking like brand monetization depending on where the money lands. And that ideological purity is often easier to perform than financial transparency. Even the legal framework doesn't fully solve this problem. Something can be technically legal and still politically lethal. A structure can comply with campaign finance law and still feel wrong to voters who don't speak legal. Most Americans don't read statutes, they read vibes. And the vibe of layered entities, luxury lifestyles, and opaque consulting fees is not reassuring. This is where defenders usually say the same thing. Everyone does it. Every politician has donors. Every politician has side income. Every politician uses consultants who happen to be friends or former staff. And they're not wrong. But everyone does it is the fastest way to kill a reform brand. You can't build a career on being different and then retreat to being normal when the questions get uncomfortable. The irony is that the more a politician emphasizes moral superiority, the more fragile their position becomes. If you present yourself as just another flawed human navigating a broken system, scandals hurt, but don't shock. If you present yourself as the conscience of the system, scandals feel like betrayal. People don't feel angry because someone might have bent a rule. They feel angry because they feel emotionally invested in the story. And emotional investment is always personal. This is why the champagne socialist label sticks even when it's unfair, exaggerated, or lazy. It's not a legal accusation, it's a cultural one. It says, you talk like you're on our side, but you live like you're on theirs. Whether that's accurate in any given case almost becomes secondary to whether it feels accurate. And feelings are the real verdict in modern politics. The deeper issue is that politics has become indistinguishable from influencer culture. AOC doesn't just legislate, she curates. She doesn't just speak, she performs. She doesn't just argue policy, she builds an aesthetic around it. That aesthetic is powerful, but it also turns her into a product that can be audited like a company. Once you're a product, everything becomes part of the brand audit. Your house, your clothes, your partner's job, your travel, your donors. People stop asking what laws you passed and start asking what lifestyle you're living. And lifestyle is a dangerous metric because it's intuitive, emotional, and brutally comparative. Voters may not know the difference between a PAC and an LLC, but they know what a $4 million house looks like. They know what a red carpet looks like. At that point, explanations have to fight not just skepticism, but resentment. Resentment from people working 2 jobs who hear movement building and think about their rent. Resentment from donors who gave $10 online and see their hero at events that cost more than their annual salary. Resentment from supporters who believed the story and now feel like they bought into a brand that quietly upgraded its target market. Resentment doesn't care about nuance. This is where political scandals usually mutate into cultural ones. It's no longer about what happened, it's about what it represents. The mansion becomes symbolic. The consulting fees become symbolic. The gala photos become symbolic. And once something becomes symbolic, it's almost impossible to dismantle with spreadsheets. Even if every financial explanation exists, even if every document checks out, the emotional damage may already be done. Because the story people internalize is simple. Someone who said, "Eat the rich," ended up living like the rich. It's a punchline that writes itself. And punchlines survive fact checks. They survive court rulings. This is why movements often collapse not from repression, but from disappointment. People can tolerate failure. They can tolerate losses. They can even tolerate mistakes. What they struggle to tolerate: feeling played. Feeling that their anger was turned into someone else's lifestyle upgrade. Feeling that authenticity was just another aesthetic choice. Even if nothing criminal is ever proven, the psychological impact is already baked in. The next time Ocasio-Cortez talks about inequality, half the audience will picture Wesley Heights. The next time she tweets about billionaires, someone will reply with a mansion emoji. The next time she frames herself as an outsider, critics will point to the very system she supposedly beat. And those images will travel faster than any rebuttal. In the end, the story isn't really about AOC. It's about what happens when politics turns into lifestyle marketing. When moral narratives become personal brands. when financial complexity collides with public simplicity, when the public starts demanding receipts instead of speeches,